This is the second part of our independent learning guide, starting to play around with things that you may have at home, such as watercolour paints or watercolour brush pens. We're quite used to the traditional watercolour palette, but now there's watercolour brush pens available. You may have either and both will work as well. Always find some scrap paper to test your materials out on. The thing is with the brush pens is that they can dry out over time. But don't panic, just dip them in water and it reactivates that watercolour. You can try different shades, you can blend them, but just make sure that all of the pens are working before you start to add them to your final piece. Once you've done that, you're ready to start to apply the colour to the work. We're going to apply the watercolour pen, but we're not going to apply it as a flat colour because we're going to use water to help the colour disperse and give watery ombre type effects. Follow some of the darker lines where you're going to have the darker blue. Add little bits of detail if you need them, but remember to leave that white so that when we add the water, it will run and give us a different kind of blue tone. You can start to bring in different shades and different tints and tones of the colour you're using, and this will add to that effect of Hundertwasser's work, where he's got all those different shades of beautiful colours all blending and merging together. We constantly review and modify, deciding where we may or may not need to add any more colour, maybe switching back to a colour we previously used, depending on the image that we're creating. Once we have those coloured details down ready, we can start to think about applying the water and letting that make the ink or the watercolour pen run and merge. Water makes the colours bleed, makes them disperse, and gives quite a subtle blend to the effect that we're trying to create. This can give us a feeling of depth and movement to the piece. You may even want different shades and decide to mix some watercolour paints and add those to it. It's fine, we can mix and match the different materials that we're using. That's the whole point of mixed media. Working into that already wet base, again, we're using that wet in wet technique, so the marks that we use are softer. They're not as harsh as if we worked onto a dry surface. We can work back into that wet surface with those watercolour pens or just the watercolour paint on a brush. It just gives us a little bit more definition to the image. We've got a little bit more control over where we want some of those darker areas. We can add fine details, dots, marks, textures or patterns depending on where we're working and the effect that we're trying to create. The next stage really is going to be moving around the picture using a combination of different materials. Would you like to use the pens, the Copic markers, normal felt pens with water to create that running effect? Do you want to use inks or food colourings? Or do you want to use watercolours and watercolour pens? You may even want to use pencil crayons in there. We can use a range of different things to create different effects. There may be areas where you're working over a paper and you need to create more of a contrast to create definition. You can do this with a Tipp-Ex pen if you've got one of those. That way you can bring out the white lines, and when it's dry, you can go back over it with the marker pen or the watercolours. We always look at Hundertwasser's work for guidance. That's where we're getting our inspiration from, and we're experimenting with medium techniques to try and give us those different types of effects. You can see here where the squares within squares have been influenced by his work, making different colour links across the picture and making a really cohesive final design. Another top tip is food colouring that you would use in baking. You can use it like coloured ink and paint it straight on.